In surveys of what makes people most proud to be British, the NHS consistently comes out as the top response by a very large margin. Even progressives who would normally find patriotism cringeworthy suddenly become flag-waving nationalists when you make Britishness about the NHS. Dr. Kristian Niemietz, Editorial Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and author of the book Universal Healthcare Without the NHS, sees NHS worship as a bizarre, irrational cult. He argues that there is nothing the NHS has achieved which dozens of other healthcare systems have not also achieved, and often better. He sees the NHS as a mediocre-to-poor healthcare system which trails behind most of its peers, and which is completely undeserving of the adulation it receives. He also argues that NHS worship is not just a harmless national eccentricity, but is an active deterrent to achieving better health outcomes. Enjoy our talk.
Thanks for coming to our second event. We thought this would be less controversial, well I did in the first one. I know at least one ticket buyer wouldn't come to the first event because he was worried about his reputation. He would come to this one. But our previous venue, Conway Hall, refused to host us because of their ties to the NHS. So I think
because of what, sorry?
Because of their ties to the NHS. They didn't want to say anything bad about the NHS. So we think we found the ultimate sacred cow.
Yes, that's a test. I can actually read you the email that we got from them.
Well, go on. Read the email.
We can be proud that we've been cancelled already, basically. So they replied, it was after about a week's wait, wasn't it? And they replied, so we don't feel this event aligns with our brand and values, as the root of the NHS has strong ties with Conway Hall, and we often speak publicly about how proud we are of this history. We just don't feel that this sits well with our messaging. And that was it. And Will just replied in a very British fashion, okay, that's no problem.
So yeah, I believe in diplomacy. Alright, so Jack will introduce our speaker and then let's get going.
I will. Did we celebrate our previous success with the first Sacred Cows event?
It was very successul. Yeah.
Thank you to everybody that did come along to that. We sold, I think, 45 plus tickets, and Alex, the speaker, was happy, and I think we had like how 20 people came to the pub. And good times. So let's keep that spirit alive. Yes.
The video link is really, really useful.
Yes.
And I've been using it lots on LinkedIn to shut people up. So
that's in my notes here.
We're going to report today.
Video and podcast available of that event if you missed it. It was about whether diverse companies really performed better. So if that's an interesting question to you, want to have a look at the evidence for that. We can give you the social links at the end. It's a bit awkward to introduce yourself, so I thought I'd introduce our presenter tonight, Dr. Kristian Niemietz. He is the Editorial Director and Head of Political Economy for the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs. For those who don't know, the IEA is a free market think tank based in the UK. Just to give you some context, their mission is to improve understanding of fundamental institutions of free society by analysis and exploration the role of markets in solving economic and social problems. So there you go. Kristian is an author, including some great title books here, my favourite being Socialism, The Failed Idea That Never Dies. Great Christmas present, I probably enjoy it. Most recently, he's just published a book called Imperial Measurement, which is a cost-benefit analysis of Western colonialism. Anyway, I'll hand over to Kristian to give his presentation on the case against the NHS.
Thank you both for the invitation, and thank you all for coming. Good evening. I should start by saying, I know the title was Why Britain Should Not Be Proud of the NHS. Normally, I don't really have views, or at least no strong views, on what people should or should not be proud of, because that's obviously a subjective concept and somewhat personal, you could say, especially when it comes to more abstract notions like national pride. I would simply say, even on its own terms. If you look at these surveys in more detail, these surveys where people are asked, what makes you most proud to be British, and the top 20, top 30, top 50 reasons, whatever. If you look at the things that people list in those surveys, what you find is it's not completely random, right? It's not that everyone mentions something different. There is a fairly clear pattern in those responses. Pretty much all of the response options that come up are things that are in some way global brands. So things that are recognized the world over, far and wide, but that are still in some way distinctly British. And that's true pretty much across the categories of the responses. So if you look at, say, popular culture, what comes up is Harry Potter and James Bond. And that makes sense. These are global brands. People the world over are going to recognize those names, and they will think of them as specifically British products, in the sense that if they had been invented somewhere else, they would not have been quite the same characters. And this is true pretty much across the board. Other things that come up in these surveys are historic events, institutions, food and drinks, pub culture is obviously in there. Again, that makes sense. This is the sort of thing where that an expat misses. I have former colleagues who now work in America, and when they come back once a year or so, and I ask them, what do you miss about this country, they would say things like the pubs, real ale, fry-ups, Sunday roasts, so the classics, and these are things that are in those surveys, always among the responses that come up most often. And these are the things where, even if you're not personally a fan of them, you don't have to be a fan personally of Harry Potter to see that makes sense. So that is something that really has traveled the world, that people do recognize and associate with this country. And that's why when you go to King's Cross and that supposedly magic platform, there's always a gaggle of tourists taking selfies. It's not completely random, the responses that people give. That's the thing, there is clearly a pattern here. There is, I guess most people couldn't spell out explicitly why they've chosen them, but it seems that there are some implicit criteria for what people list. And it's really on those terms, the NHS that is the odd one out. Or rather, there's two odd ones out. The other one is beans on toast, but I'm guessing that one is not meant entirely seriously. There's probably a hint, an element of self-irony here. But the NHS, I think, is a completely unironic response option, and it's not just any. It's the one that's always on top. And when they say how many people or what percentage mentioned it, it's not even a context. There is no close second. It's always a massive gap where you have the NHS mentioned by well over 50%, absolute majority, and everything else is just in the single digits. So the NHS is the odd one out here. It does not, if you take these implicit criteria of these lists, it's the NHS that doesn't fit in, because it isn't in any way a global brand. I know there is this phrase, envy of the world, but that's just a complete self-delusion. And also it's hard to see what's so specifically British about it, because to me it's just a nationalized industry, and nationalized industries have existed throughout the world and for a long time. And yes, of course, you could say it has some specific design features that make it a bit unusual, but I don't think that's what anyone means when they say they're proud of the NHS. So what is it then? This is a quote that I came across a few days ago. I don't want to pick on this actor here specifically, because you could really very easily find hundreds of quotes of that nature. There's the NHS saved my life when I was 10, blah blah, saved my daughter's life, save this, save that. Now, the problem with sentiments like that, and again you can find loads of celebrities and politicians as well saying things like that. The problem with a description like that is that, well, just imagine for a moment what it would sound like if somebody talked about any other institution, public, private, or otherwise, in such a way. Or if somebody talked about any other policy area in such a way, saying, I'm so grateful to our school system because it was there for me and it taught me how to read and write. Or I'm so grateful for our pension system because without it, all the old people would starve. And that would sound a bit weird. Why? Well, because first of all, we just know that it's not that unusual that a developed country has a school system of some sort, that a developed country has a pension system of some sort. And we also know that if we didn't have the particular system that we have now, if we didn't have this particular school system, if we didn't have this particular pension system, we would have something else. It's not that the alternative is to have nothing. It's not that the alternative to the present school system is no schools and nobody ever learns how to read and write. The alternative to the present pension system is not that there would be nothing once you stop working. The alternative would just be, well, we'll have some other system that would be organized in a different way, financed in a different way, maybe be better, maybe be worse, but we just know that, and therefore it would sound weird if somebody was particularly defensive or grateful or proud of the system in those areas that we have now. And that's also why in pretty much every other policy area, it's not at all unusual that somebody would compare the system we have now to realistic alternatives. So this is the standard, almost a template, we could say, for a standard Guardian article. They would do this all the time, where they say, well, why can't we have a school system like in Finland? It's so much better than ours. Why can't we have a childcare system, daycare system like Sweden? So much better than ours. Why can't we have a social housing system like Austria or wherever? That's completely normal in every other policy area. And it wouldn't occur to anyone, if somebody made such a case about education, to say, how dare you offend our wonderful teachers and teaching assistants? Because that would just be self-evidently stupid. It's just clear that if somebody compares education systems and talks about why they think some alternative is maybe better, they're not blaming individual people working in the system. They're talking about mechanisms, structures, delivery models, and that's why that's a completely normal kind of argument that you find in the left-wing press, right-wing press, centrist press. Everybody does that, completely normal argument. It's only when it comes to the NHS that that would be, well, that people would react in such a defensive way. So 2 years or 3 years ago, I wrote something about a report about NHS performance during the pandemic, and said it wasn't great, nothing special really. And Angela Rayner somehow got wind of this and wrote an open letter to Matt Hancock, who was the health secretary at the time, saying, you have to condemn this report. It had absolutely nothing to do with him, but she said, you have to condemn it, you have to distance yourself from it, because this is an outrageous attack on our wonderful nurses who go out and risk their lives and so forth. And so to see the weirdness in this, you just need to imagine for a moment, what if somebody did that about literally any other policy area? And that's how it would sound cultish. So implied in that statement is, of course, the idea that if it wasn't for the NHS, there would be either no healthcare or at least no accessible healthcare, or not the kind of healthcare that's accessible to everybody. And that's usually the implicit premise, and that's the thing that people clearly value most about the NHS, the fact that it is there for everybody and universally accessible. And that's true, it is. But you could say this about almost any healthcare system in the developed world. So this chart here shows what's called health system coverage, which basically just means the percentage of the population in various OECD countries that have guaranteed access to healthcare. And what they mean by that is not just any healthcare, because obviously everyone can buy a pack of paracetamols, that's healthcare of sorts, but that's not what they mean. They compare a predefined package which includes primary care, specialist care, hospitals, diagnostics, pharmaceuticals, so on and so forth. So the full package, really, a package of the basic healthcare services, and they just compare what percentage of the population in different places have guaranteed access to that. So in an insurance-based system, they would just look at literally the number of people, the percentage of the population that are insured, and in a tax finance system like this one, they would just think of that as an implicit insurance mechanism. They would then just say, well, in such a system, that's as if the health system was a massive insurer, and everybody who lives in the country is just automatically enrolled. Either way, what you see is simply that this is close to 100% in pretty much all of the developed world, and if you want to, well, either literally 100% or 99 point something, but even when it's that, even when there's when it's not exactly 100%, there's usually some obvious reason for that. It's not that there's people who fall through the cracks, but it's more that you may have cross-border tourism, people who live in Belgium but work in Luxembourg or so, and they get some opt-out. And even most middle-income countries have close to universal coverage nowadays. It's really only the system in the United States that is the outlier. They are the only developed country where there is an uninsured population of about 10% of the total. But what it shows generally is that if you want to make a system universally accessible, that's very easy. It doesn't matter what kind of system you have. Any system can be universal if the political will is there. So the only difference is really that if you have a tax finance system like this one here, and you just make it open to everybody, then that system is automatically a universal one from day one. For the same reason that you could say access to public parks is universal, simply in the sense that they are there and there's no access control. In the same way, if you run healthcare facilities like a public park, then that's automatically a universal system. Some systems were not universal when they were founded. There you need to make it work. You need to do things like, firstly, you have to make it mandatory, so everybody has to sign up, and you need some system in place for people who can't afford the premiums. So you have to have a mechanism to say, well, if you can't pay for your own premiums, then there will be, there's this program through which the government will pay your premium for you. And that does take a bit more work. That is something that you have to actively work towards. So maybe 100 years ago, this would have been a slightly different argument. But nowadays what we see is they've all managed it. Even if they weren't founded as universal systems, but they all are nowadays, that's really not the issue. Can be done in any system. Even in the United States, they could if they wanted to. They just have this weird setup where they have, this coverage gap they have. A means tested program for poor people, which is Medicaid, which is if you earn below a certain threshold, then you qualify for that. It's just that once, if you earn $1 more than that limit, you lose your coverage, and not everybody who earns a little bit above that limit is automatically prosperous enough to pay for their own health insurance. That's how you get this problem in the US system with that coverage gap. But again, that's their political choice. They could, if they truly wanted to, they could make their system universal too, just like all the others have managed. That's, short summary is, that's just really not a special achievement. I would understand the defensiveness or maybe even gratitude a bit more if it had exceptionally good outcomes, but it just doesn't. This is a measure which looks at it's an attempt to measure healthcare outcomes across systems. An index that's called treatable avoidable mortality, and this is just the number of avoidable deaths adjusted for population size in the healthcare system. What they do with this measure, the idea here is simply that they compare what actually happens in the health system, so the survival rates for various conditions. They compare what actually happens to the best that would be medically possible. So you compare the actual to the ideal, and they interpret that gap between the actual and the ideal as an avoidable death, and a death that could have been avoided through better healthcare. And the idea is also to strip out deaths that happen outside of the healthcare system. So say if somebody dies in a road accident, dies on the spot, then obviously no healthcare system in the world could have done anything for that person. That's not counted. This is really insofar as it is mediated through the healthcare system. You have some contact with the healthcare system. What's your survival chances compared to what would be possible in an ideal world? what we see is no system reaches that ideal. There are some avoidable deaths everywhere. So Switzerland is the best in the world on this particular measure. Even they have avoidable deaths. It's not zero anywhere, but we see big differences. Britain is not terrible by global standards, so you still have better survival chances in the healthcare system than in most of Eastern Europe or Latin America. So by global standards, it's not terrible, it's just compared to Western Europe, compared to developed countries elsewhere. Say, I don't know if Japan is in the yes, here they are, or South Korea, or so. If you just compare to a more selective group, which I've done here, where you could say this is actually a more realistic comparison group. There, it is clearly one of the worst, so about on a par with Greece or with Chile, the most developed Latin American country. Again, by global standards, not terrible, because by global standards, Greece and Chile are not terrible. It's just that for Western Europe, for established first world, old industrialized countries, this is not a fantastic outcome. And this is a similar measure where published by The Lancet, where they this is an overall index of the quality. They start with this measure that I've shown and they process it in some way and produce a ranking list where this dark blue color basically means top decile, light blue color means the second, so a step down, step removed from the top. What we see is simply that in Western Europe, it's really only Portugal, Greece, and the UK which are not in the top decile. So again, by global standards, not a terrible system. Of course, if you look at the wider map, it would seem pretty good, better than Eastern Europe, better than North Africa, but compared to the most realistic benchmark group, not a fantastic outcome. Now, the one study that always comes up as a counter-argument is the one by the Commonwealth Fund, which you may have seen. They publish this ranking every 3 or 4 years where they compare, it's now 11 systems, used to be less than that, varies from year to year, but they compare a number of systems, and this is, of all the international rankings, that's the one that's most favorable, most flattering for the NHS. NHS usually comes out on top, in this case 4th place, but in some of the previous ones number 1 even. That's why when that happens, that always gets trumpeted in The Guardian and The Independent. There's just one problem with this particular study. You can see here these are the criteria. They have 5 different criteria, and the outcomes are just one of them, and that means outcomes are just 20% of the overall ranking. Whereas, of course, with all these other criteria, they are legitimate things to look at. It's just that if you ask a random person, or if I asked in this room, if I asked, what do you think it means to say a health system is ranked top or ranked 4th, you would probably think, well, this means that it must have good outcomes. But it doesn't mean that in this case. And if we look specifically at this healthcare outcomes category, here, the UK is actually 9th out of 11. So again, not brilliant, and that's actually the best it's ever been. So far, it's always been, in all the previous editions, always been second to last. So it's not that the Commonwealth Fund study disagrees with what I've just said. They confirm this point that the NHS is not a brilliant system on outcomes, that it is behind its peers. It's just that they look at other things and they dilute the bad outcomes in that way, you could say. But all you need to do is change the weightings a bit. You could make a case for saying, well, outcomes are clearly more important than all the procedural stuff here. So if you gave that a weight of, say, 50 or 60% rather than 20, then you would get a very different ranking in the Commonwealth Fund study. Now, these are measurable clinical outcomes. Another thing that matters, I guess, to most people is waiting times. Even though that's not necessarily a matter of life or death, but still, when you're suffering from something, you probably want to be seen sooner rather than later. For waiting times, we don't have a lot of international data, which is in itself telling. It's that in most systems, that's just not considered a big issue, so they don't even bother collecting the data. It's just for the same reason that say we don't have data for how long it takes to get a pint at the pub. We just think, well, in most cases it's not a big problem. We don't need a specific database for that. So most systems don't do that. The Netherlands are one exception. They do that because they have historically had similar problems to Britain with long waiting times. It's just they've cut them massively over the past 15 years or so. And what we see, so I haven't found up-to-date data for waiting times by condition for Britain. So I've taken the ones from just before COVID, and I've compared that to the Dutch figures from now, even though they are, of course, also suffering from a COVID backlog, not nearly as much as here, but they've had waiting times going up as well. So what this does here is, this is a comparison which is ludicrously biased in favor of the NHS. You couldn't weight the scale more heavily in favor of the NHS. It still comes out behind the system of the Netherlands, where with one exception, for all the conditions where data is listed, you get your appointment substantially faster in the Netherlands than here. And again, this is a comparison of a system that's suffering from the post-COVID backlog and a system that isn't because of that time difference. Even so, you still get that difference. So it's pretty clear whether you care about purely about medical outcomes or about softer measures like waiting times. It's pretty clear that the NHS is usually behind.
What's PCTA mean at the end? On the right.
Oh, I can't remember. That was some very long.
Not everybody knew what it was. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a long word, even for me as a German speaker. Shouldn't say that way.
I actually wonder whether it was maybe cancer.
I'll look it up. So the counter argument that often comes up nowadays in particular is that, well, of course the NHS is doing badly now because the Tories have destroyed it. 14 years of defunding and sabotage and trying to dismantle it. What do you expect? It's not the NHS that's the problem, it's just the current government and their deliberate boycotting and undermining of it. There's a couple of problems with this idea that there was at some point a golden age when the NHS was doing brilliantly, and that it's only in recent years that it has declined in that way. And that is, if we look at the same measures I've shown for what must have been in that mindset the golden age around 2010, it looks pretty much the same, or it looks in absolute terms it looks actually worse than now. This measure here, avoidable deaths, treatable mortality, was worse 14 years ago than it is now, and the ranking pretty much the same as now. And again, this is the non-ambitious comparison group where I've included a lot of poorer or more recently industrialized countries. If we change this again to the more realistic benchmark group, you see, well, again, on a par with the developed parts of Latin America roughly. But certainly not great by Western European standards. And this is 2010, the supposed golden age, which never existed. And the same for the Commonwealth Fund. So this is one of their previous studies, 2014, but with data that's a bit older. There's always a lag time with the healthcare data. So data is from around 2010-11, so before the supposed Tory defunding, Tory sabotage. Again, the same result as before. Yes, overall number one, but the outcomes category had a different name then, but that's what I mean here. The outcomes category, 10 out of 11, second to last, and that's the supposed golden age. So again, that idea just doesn't stack up. But also, it also fails on a more basic level, which is if you compare healthcare spending as a proportion of the size of the economy. Britain isn't that unusual. So where is that defunding here? What we see is, of course, the United States completely in a league of its own, almost 17% of GDP. Pretty much all of Western Europe, somewhere between 8, or even including Eastern Europe, somewhere between 8 and 12%. Britain being just outside the top 5. in terms of sort of a little over 11% of GDP on healthcare spending. This is mostly NHS plus a bit on, say, private payment for dentistry and prescription charges, things like that. So actually in the top group and ahead of some of the ones that do better. Now here I should add, this is if you look at it in as a percentage of GDP. You could also look at it in absolute terms, in international dollars. Then it looks a bit different. That's simply because some of the, because the economy has been doing so badly for such a long time, that GDP per capita is behind a lot of the neighbors. So in terms of the percentage of GDP, maybe identical if you compare Switzerland to Britain, but then of course Switzerland is a much richer country, so for them that percentage of GDP per capita is in absolute terms a much larger number. Nonetheless, there is a good reason why this is the standard measure for healthcare comparisons, percent of GDP rather than cash terms, and that is that most healthcare spending is staff costs. And staff costs tend to rise more or less in line with GDP. So in wealthier countries, people in the health workforce earn more, of course. And that's why a dollar or pound or euro franc buys you a lot more healthcare in Britain than it does in Switzerland. Even if that is adjusted for differences in the overall price level, it's that the healthcare sector in particular is responsive to differences in wealth levels. What you would have to do ideally, if you wanted to express it in cash terms, would be you would need a price level measure specifically for healthcare rather than an overall, rather than an adjustment that compares the price of supermarkets or whatever. You would need one that looks specifically at the health sector. Then cash terms will make sense. Percentage of GDP is the conventional established measure, and for good reason. I should also add that historically it's been true that healthcare spending here used to be lower than in most of Western Europe, so that's why Tony Blair about 25 years ago had this pledge, I'm going to raise healthcare spending to the Western European average, or NHS spending, and which he mostly did. So if we looked at this in the 90s or 80s, then that would be true historically. The NHS was a more stingently funded, more of a bare bones system than others, and this increase is a more recent phenomenon. So it's not. I don't want to dismiss it entirely. There are differences in spending, or at least there used to be until quite recently. But even there, I would say that doesn't really explain the differences that I've just shown, which are the life or death measures, the bread and butter issues of a healthcare system. I'd say what happens with healthcare spending is that once you reach a certain level, spending more than that means that your system can become more generous. It can afford to offer things that are not necessary for survival, but that are just nice to have. Things that affect your quality of life, but that you're not going to see in measures like the ones that I've shown with avoidable mortality. That's the difference. If that was the criticism against the NHS, then even I would say, no, that's a bit unfair. So there was, a couple of months ago, there was an article in the Telegraph where they talked about a woman in southwest Germany who had some condition that was unpleasant but not life-threatening, and they talked about how she got immediately the very best of what's medically possible and got a luxury treatment, and the implication being why can't we have that here? There I would say, okay, well, that comparison is a bit unfair, because if you want that kind of service and that kind of level, then you have to be prepared to spend 12% or more of your GDP on healthcare. There, that percentage point difference, that does make a difference, but it would be a bit like, say, if we compare traveling Ryanair or EasyJet with traveling business class on British Airways or American Airlines, where, say, if Ryanair is less convenient to use and less good in terms of customer service, that we would expect. They would say, well, okay, you get what you pay for, and if they don't offer meals and unlimited wine on board, fair enough, that's just not their business model. But nonetheless, if, say, Ryanair planes crashed more often than British Airways planes, or if they were cancelled all the time, then you wouldn't say, oh, well, that's just because of the lower price. We do expect them to do the core service, getting you from A to B on time, to do just as well as any of the luxury airlines. It's where we have tolerance for Ryanair underperforming compared to Qatar Airways or whatever it was called, the luxury one. We expect them to underperform in terms of amenity levels and comfort, but because there it's absolutely fair to say you pay less, you get less, but we still have the expectation of them to get you from A to B on time. There we wouldn't consider the price level, the price difference as a justifiable reason for doing worse. And I'd say with healthcare, with survival rates, we should think of it in those terms too. A less well-funded system, Britain isn't the best example here for this, but say, I think Taiwan and Hong Kong are perhaps the closest real examples here. These are Ryanair systems, we could say. They don't offer a lot of comfort, but they get the basics right. If you have something that's potentially life-threatening, then there you'll get decent treatment. They just don't do things that are just nice to have. If we had a system like that there, it would be fair to say, okay, well, it's just a difference in spending levels, can't expect to get more than that, but it's not what we see. We have a system that's doing bad on the bread and butter issues, never mind the fact that it is less generous than other systems. If you look for them, you can find some measures where the lost golden age idea looks a bit more realistic. Some things did get worse more recently, waiting times in particular. So this is a comparison of the total number of people who are on an NHS waiting list since 2007. And there we really do see that it does matter who's in government. It falls during the Labour government, and then shortly after the 2010 election, 2 years later or so, starts to go up, even before the pandemic. There you could say, okay, the other lot did a better job at that. That would be fair enough. It's just that even here, I would say, to the extent that it's true that some governments may be better at managing the NHS than others, that's not really an external constraint where you can say the NHS is totally blameless of that. It's more that if you want a system that's state-run, if you want a nationalized system, it just comes with the territory that politics matters. It comes with the territory that you will sometimes have a government that you don't like, and those are the rules of the game that you've signed up to. And then you can't complain about the game because you're on the losing side. It is just true even if you could show that it's systematically true that the NHS always does better under Labour governments than Tory governments, that would not be much of a defence, because in a two-party system you will sometimes get Tory governments. And if the healthcare system can't cope with that, if it's so dependent on having the right people in charge, that's not a robust system. We don't see that kind of pattern in other sectors. Imagine that we have, every time there was a change in government, suddenly the pubs would get worse. You get longer waiting times until you get your pint. Then we would say, well, why don't we organize the pubs in such a way that they're less dependent on politics, that it doesn't matter that much whether you have a Labour or a Tory government, or whether it's this wing of the party or that wing. I'd say if it just comes with the territory of a nationalized, politicized system that political mood swings matter, and that is not an external constraint that you can hold the NHS completely blameless for. It is just true that what happened in the Blair years, the reason why you got this big injection in the early 2000s, was that was a time when the general political mood was, or certainly Tony Blair's idea, his analysis of the status quo was that the British economy was basically doing fine. Britain's public finances were basically fine. Britain can afford to spend more on public services that people value. That was the thinking at the time, and possibly justified. And then in the Cameron years, you had a very different political mood, of course. There, the mood was, rightly or wrongly, that the country was living beyond its means, had maxed out the credit card, and that it was just a time of different political priorities. Would have been true even if Gordon Brown had won in 2010, there would have been some change. And that's just what happens in politics. You get mood swings, you get differences in the political thinking of the day, and that's an argument for having a healthcare system that is several steps removed from politics, a system where the financing agencies, whatever those are, can raise their own money and don't have to ask the government of the day for permission. So to the extent that there's some truth in the idea of government mismanagement, I'd say, well, if you're a defender of a politicized system, sorry, you got what you asked for. You just don't have the government that you want, but that's always going to be the case in a democracy. And if you're like that, you should be in favor of a less political system. Now finally, you could say that the one benefit that the NHS maybe has compared to other systems is that it does create this maypole effect of people rallying around it. And I have to say, I'm generally in favor of having institutions like that. I think it's generally a good thing if countries have institutions or traditions or anything that everyone can rally around. That's not in principle a bad thing. So that's why I have a fairly positive view of the monarchy, even though you could say if we designed a political system from scratch today, we probably wouldn't invent the monarchy again. It's not a system you would rationally think or draw up on a whiteboard, but nonetheless, it's there, people like it, and there I say, well, fair enough, proof is in the pudding. And people do take part in the celebrations of the royal family in a way that you would never do for an elected president, even if they were a popular politician. And that's why, for a while, so I've been writing about healthcare on and off for many years. So it took several years of a break, and then got dragged back into it. There was a time when I had a period of self-doubt, where I thought, maybe I'm just thinking about this in the wrong way. Maybe I shouldn't think of it as a healthcare system that is designed to produce the best possible outcomes and short waiting times and cost effectiveness. Maybe it makes more sense to think of it as a monarchy equivalent, or as just, and that maybe when I go around and show comparisons of survival rates, maybe I'm the equivalent of the Otto English types who run around on St. George's Day and try to ruin the fun for everyone by saying, did you know, St. George wasn't actually English. I thought maybe I'm the Otto English of the healthcare world, but I don't think I am, because while it's a great thing to have unifying institutions, the NHS isn't really unifying at all. We actually have a constant culture war around the NHS as well. So we get headlines like this, which again, this is Owen Jones, 2013, farewell to the NHS. Dear trust friend finally murdered by Tory ideologues. And this is, wrote a paper on this as well, on conspiracy theories that there's somebody who's trying to destroy the NHS. That's been around for, well, at least as long as I've been alive, since 1980. That's a recurring theme, and that shows that's not a unifying institution when you get these hysterical culture wars around it. I'd say an institution can only be unifying if everyone accepts that it's there for everyone. Say, like Christmas, you wouldn't say, well, Christmas is a far left thing, or Christmas is a centrist thing, or a conservative thing, and if you don't think like me politically, then you're an enemy of it. The NHS, what makes it different from actual unifying institutions is that there is a part of the political ideological spectrum, which is the socialist left, which claims it as theirs and accuses everyone else of being an enemy of it. And that means it can't be a unifying institution. Or perhaps an even better example, if you remember this from the last general election. So this idea that there's some secret plan around to destroy the NHS. Again, in my paper, I found quotes from going back until 1980, always been there. It's just that before this event, I think this was November 2019 or so, people didn't think of this secret plan to destroy the NHS as an actual document. Corbyn, as so often, went the extra mile and printed this out and said, I found the literal plan. It was absolutely nothing like that, of course, but the fact that this is possible and was endorsed by parts of the mainstream media shows you, even on, if you want to make a communitarian case for this system, well, not really, because there's nothing unifying about it. So I'd say the best defenses of the NHS that I've seen so far are from organisations like the Nuffield Trust and the King's Fund, the think tanks that specialise in healthcare and that know all the nerdy details, all the three-letter acronyms. They will say, they're not signed up to this cultishness necessarily. They do say, well, yes, outcome-wise, it's not brilliant. They would say, well, maybe it would be nice if we had a different system, but it's just difficult to do that, and let's stick to what's tried and tested. Okay, but that's a more the kind of argument that you make if you resign yourself to it. What the alternative is, I haven't talked about that today, and deliberately, that's a separate, that's a discussion for a separate event or separate publication. Whatever the appropriate alternative is, whether it should be this system, that system, a mixed system, a more marketized system, or whether we should just resign ourselves to the system we have, that's a separate discussion. But even if you take the latter view and think, well, let's just give up on reform and accept that we have what we have. Fair enough, but at least I'd say let's not kid ourselves that this is somehow a wonderful system that's above its peers. And I think I've spoken for too long already, but I'll end on that note.
Thank you, Kristian. That was fantastic. We're going to have a 15-minute break, get a drink, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Yes, Czechoslovakia did that in the early 90s. And then the Czech Republic and Slovakia continued that separately. And the way they did it, I don't know the details about it, but they created a national insurance fund where they said everybody is now just signed up to that automatically. And then they just introduced freedom of choice. They said from now on you can set up a health insurer if you want to. You can switch from the national insurer to the competing private ones. And over time it just merged into a multi-payer insurance system. So, and you could say East Germany did that too. And they had a state-run system and they just adopted the West German one. Almost automatically, just part of the reunification process. But it still meant they had to start from scratch. And that, so in the case of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, it took, I guess, well, it depends on how you want to count it, depends on where you want to, from what point onwards you want to say, okay, this is now no longer an NHS type system, this is now a competitive insurance system. But it happened over the course of the 90s. In the East German case, it took 2 years. So it can be done. Yes?
Do you have any thoughts about the way that it sort of feels free to us when we access the NHS, how that has an impact on the psychology? So for example, we never see any bill, any invoice, no one asks you for your insurance number, there's nothing like that. If someone looks after your mum when you're in a really emotional state and people are nice to her and then you come away feeling better, is that, and nobody asks you for any details. Is that the same in all these countries? Is there any other example of like an invisible transaction in a similar way? And do you think that has an impact on the kind of psychology of how we feel about the NHS?
Yeah, I mean, in most systems there is a co-payment of some sort. You could, in principle, have a completely free at the point of use private system as well. I would be in favour of that. I think there's nothing wrong with a modest co-payment as long as you have a safety net, as long as you make sure that that is not the access barrier. But yes, I certainly think that explains some of the cultishness around it, that say if we had a co-payment for a lot of services, even if it was a very low level, this proposal that comes up every couple of years, £10 for a GP, and then of course you get a massive outrage, more and quickly gets shut down. If we had something like that and changed nothing else, I think that would go some way to changing the cultishness, because then people would say, well, I've paid not much, but I've paid something, and this is what I get, really. And but yeah, there is something about the psychology of getting stuff for free, even if you know perfectly well at some level that it isn't free and that you just pay in a more roundabout way. But I remember watching a documentary where East Germans were asked several years after reunification, what is it that you remember positively? And they all mentioned things that they were given for free under the socialist system. Even though all of those were things that, of course, you can get now too, and far more and far better. But there is just something in our psychology about the difference between no price and a low price. And you see this in why there was such a big switch once they introduced plastic bag charges. I think it was initially, was it 10 pence or even 5? It was a very small amount, 5 p. Nonetheless, suddenly you saw loads of people carrying stuff around. And that's just the difference between, in a way, while the increase from 5 to 10 or 10 to whatever it is now, that didn't cause massive behavioral changes. It's just a difference from 0 to something that makes a difference. Yes.
How can a co-payment system not be an economic barrier to some?
How can it not be what?
How can an MD who has to pay more will be deterred from seeking proper health care? We know, for example, there is good evidence, and I can't remember the study, it's published in the BMJ, that charging GP time, there's good evidence there that deters people from going to see the GP. Now, it's good if people who don't have a problem are deterred from going to the GP, but it's the ones who can't afford the 10 quid or 20 quid or whatever, if they're, who are ill, who are deterred from going to the GP, it will harm people.
Well,
so why is co-pay? Why is there even co-payment?
Well,
why do people have to pay more?
All the systems that I know anything about that have co-payments combine that with a safety mechanism. So if say,
so you have to build an extra mechanism just to cope with a co-payment system.
Yes.
At extra expense.
Well, but I mean that's basically what the prescription charge is too. But it doesn't mean that you have to document your entire employment history. It's more that, say, here we have the passported benefits. If you're on universal credit, you're automatically exempt. You can do it in that way, or you can just have a cap. Once you reach a certain amount, it no longer goes up. So it really depends on how you do it. But there is, so the system in Switzerland is perhaps the best example here. They have pretty high co-payments, far more than I think pretty much any of the other systems that I've looked at. But they nonetheless have the Commonwealth Fund. They have this this measure of equity, where they simply they look at some surveys of patient experience. They combine. They compare people on above average and people on below average incomes, and they look at, is there a substantial difference that higher earners have a better experience of the healthcare system than below average earners, and they find in Switzerland very little. It's one of the most equitable systems too, despite the fact that people who can pay are asked to pay. But I mean, there is, yeah, okay, so there's more questions. Yes?
What tractable healthcare reforms would you propose as a way of getting around the fact that the public has certain attitudes about the NHS?
I don't think you can realistically. There needs to be a change in public attitudes first, and that's when meaningful system change can happen. But if you try to do anything now and just went totally against the grain. So it's not that you have to convince everybody. I'm sure in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, it's not that everybody was in favor of this system change in the early 90s. But you have to at least reach a situation where most people are at least okay with it. And we're nowhere near that yet. So the only example that I can realistically think of is the co-payment issue again. That's a good way to desacralize it, and I'd say that would be an added benefit. So even quite apart from the fact that it should lead to some more more rational use of healthcare resources, that if you have some routine thing where you realize, well, I don't actually need to see a doctor because what's the doctor going to say? But it would have that psychological impact, and that would be a benefit. Yes?
Are you able to identify which specific aspects of its monolithic structure sort of cause inefficiencies, or is it more just you see it's not very good and general free market theory would imply that is the reason?
It is mostly that, but there's also the fact that I've looked at the impact of the Blair reforms, early 2000s, where they did introduce some market elements. So the NHS as it is now is no longer, I know sometimes people on my side, the classic liberal, libertarian side of the argument, sometimes describe the NHS as Soviet or Stalinist, which it may have been at some point, but that's actually post-Blair, that's no longer true. Blair introduced a system where you get greater choice and where the payment follows you to, depending on, according to the choices you make. So there is some element of marketization in it, far less than some of these systems, but more than in the 90s thing. And there is some evidence that caused improvements already by increasing competition, that even within, so there's the idea, sometimes you hear the argument that markets only work for very simple products, where it's just very easy to judge quality and what you want. I could just say, well, I like this pint, didn't like the one that I had before, so I'll choose this brewery again. But that healthcare isn't like that. Some people have the idea that in more complex, for more complex products and services, markets don't work. But that isn't really what we see. Once choice was introduced, people did discriminate in favor of the better performing NHS trusts, and that doesn't mean that they downloaded standardized mortality rates from their website or from the NHS website, but it's just like in many other sectors. Say, I couldn't tell you how this technology works. I couldn't judge it on its own terms, but I know that Sony is a trusted brand, and as long as there's a reasonably good correlation between brand reputation and actual quality, that's all it takes. You don't need to be perfectly informed. You don't need the textbook model of the hyper-rational, perfectly informed consumer for competition to make a positive difference. Question here.
I know a lot of people, friends, who already access private insurance through their work. So do you think there's already a kind of two-tier system in the UK where some people are sort of accessing private healthcare, and do you think that's just going to get bigger and that's going to be the ultimate kind of solution to the problem?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment it happens in a fairly chaotic way. It's very ad hoc, haphazard. You have a bad experience, or you just don't get treated at all, and then you go for private insurance. Now, I haven't seen, since the private insurance sector here is still quite small, I haven't seen any data on the customer profile on who gets private insurance, but I'm pretty sure, I would bet that it is mostly the better off who could get that. And that doesn't have to be that way. So Australia has a system where you can get tax rebates for taking out private insurance, and they have a bit more than half of the population there do have private insurance, at least for some things, top up. And that's not necessarily a rich people thing. Well, it can't be by definition. If it's more than half of the population, then they can't all be millionaires. But it's also, even though the average privately insured person is somewhat better off than the average not privately insured person, it's not, you get rich people who don't have it, and you get poor people who do have it. So I'd rather have a more, I do want to see more take-up of private insurance, but I'd rather see that happen in a more coordinated way, and in a way where you do make sure that that it doesn't have to be a rich people thing only, because so far the private healthcare sector here has been a luxury segment, and this is, I guess, what you expect. If you have a national pub service, you would have some private pubs, but they would all be very upmarket. They would be maybe mostly cocktail bars or something. And this is the way private health insurance has developed here. Whereas some of the systems that have just always been private insurance based or for a long time, nobody would think that this is somehow a rich people thing. Yes?
So I thought I'd defend the defenders of the NHS. I thought it was slightly unfair the way they're portrayed as kind of maple dancing and just being not caring about outcome. I feel like the defenders of the NHS they really like the idea that they find it very objectionable that health treatment, healing is affected by whether you're rich or poor. So they want that completely separate, and that's a kind of sacred principle for them, which is different to the things that you mentioned, where it's just like, yeah, it's like the monarchy. They just don't know about their outcomes. And also, I suppose you were talking about like whether the system could, if you want, it doesn't make sense to say it's the Tories, but there are countries that have moved to a consistently high tax kind of political climate, like Sweden. It's just like consistently very high tax, even if it goes up and down, it's still at a much higher level than most European countries. So wouldn't you say it's, would you agree or not whether it's kind of rational if you value this kind of sacred principle that healthcare should be separate from your wealth level, regardless of efficiency and outcomes, and that you could feasibly move to a consistently high tax environment, and from that perspective, the pro-NHS argument has a bit of rationality.
Is that like comprehensive schools, if everyone should go to the same local school?
Yeah,
to level up and level down?
Yeah, I'd say it's the same kind of principle that is like, they would see it as just really sort of obscene that someone gets much better healthcare or education just because they happen to be richer.
Yeah. Doesn't sound very realistic, but...
Well, it's not my opinion, but I understand it.
No.
You're still managing the argument. That's fine. I'd say if that was somebody's main objection, if somebody said, I'm defending the NHS because I start from the presumption that other systems have a much bigger income gradient where the quality of care does depend a lot more on how rich or poor you are, then I say, if somebody then showed to you that that's just empirically not the case, and if that's really your main objection, then you should immediately be able to say, oh, okay, I didn't know that, in that case, fair enough. Then I'm just as okay with a Swiss-style system, or just as okay with a Dutch-style system. If they achieve that outcome just in a different way, I'm perfectly comfortable with that too. It's just that literally never happens.
But I think you're thinking in terms of outcomes, and they're not thinking in terms of outcome. The means matter. The means, regardless of the outcome, can be like pure or impure.
Yeah.
So even if...
but how is that not Maple-like? How is that not that is not sacred values?
I think everyone thinks a little bit in those terms, like, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but like, if you know that you received money from crime, from like a murder or something, well, actually the crime's already taken place, and maybe you're getting the money has no effect on that crime happening, but you still feel dirty getting it. So that's an example, and that's very natural and human.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that there is definitely also an anti-commercial thinking behind it, that it is somehow just immoral to treat healthcare as a commodity and buy it on the market the way you buy pints or computers. Where I'd simply say, well, but it is effectively that. Doctors don't work for free or for the joy of it. It's just that healthcare is a commodity in this country too. It's just that we have a monopoly purchaser of it. But yeah, that's definitely part of the psychology. So strong egalitarian ethos, but I think even more so the latent anti-capitalist mindset. I think very few people, even if it turned out, and I don't know if this is true, but if it turned out that one of the market-based systems achieved more equitable outcomes, I don't think many people would change their mind on that basis. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, how relevant do you think it is that, I think one of the best known examples, I think we actually, unfortunately Brits are very ignorant of the healthcare systems in Europe, willfully or not. I think there may be some willful ignorance, but they see the US, they see the biggest economy in the world, the richest major economy even in the world, and they say, okay, well they have a terrible healthcare system, lots of people don't get treated, it's not very equitable, your stats show it, and there's plenty of other ones. And they say, well, maybe because Britain is sort of embedded in two worlds. We're European, even mostly, we're still European, but we're also part of the Anglosphere and we share a close history with the US. And I think we sort of, because of the hegemonic status, we always look to them anyway. And do you think this plays a role in our sort of impression that, well, the greatest country, at least economically and in many other ways perhaps, the world gets horribly wrong, was so much better than them, at least we give it to anyone, we uphold these. It could be some sort of anti-capitalism as well, but we do a lot better than the US, but we must be, doing something right. And let's ignore the fact, well, let's put on the blinkers and we'll say, well, France, Italy, Netherlands, Germany, they all do it better, but we'll just sort of push that to the one side and sort of wishful thinking and a very selective focus on the US. Do you think that plays a role?
Yes, absolutely. I used to think that too, that maybe it is. And I saw somebody, can't remember where I read this, somebody made the argument in one of the books about the history of the NHS, where his argument was, we watch a lot of political drama, some of it where doctors may be main characters, often based in the US, and there you see some of the bad things happening. We don't have an equivalent of that with other systems, so that's just closer to people's minds. But then I'd also, as the counter argument to that would be that while it's true that most people don't know much about different healthcare systems, just like I didn't know it either until I started writing about it. There's no reason why you would. It's only when you go live somewhere or whatever that you want to find out maybe about that. But there's no reason why Joe Public should have the knowledge of a health economist. It's just that you could say this about many other policy areas too. Nonetheless, you would not get a hostile response for saying there's a better school system in Finland or so. The person who reads that headline in The Guardian probably off the top of their heads are not going to know, are not going to have any experience of the Finnish school system or any detailed knowledge of how it works. They would just say, okay, well, I don't know much about that system, but if you think that system is better, tell me more about it.
Do you think there's something unique, probably intrinsic to the subject matters and saving people's lives, or at least making them better, that is somehow more sacred than just educating people well? It's intrinsic to the subject matter rather than just...
I'd say even there you could say firefighters save people's lives, but if somebody said...
There's something else to it. Okay.
All right. So if somebody said there's a totally different way of organizing fire services, I don't think you would get totally hostile defensive responses. Yes.
Well, any thoughts, Kristian, on when the NHS started to become sort of a religion, and is it seen in a similar light in any of the other countries on your chart?
I've tried to find out about it. I've never been able to really track anything down. The only thing I can say is that I've seen elements of it in stories. When I wrote this paper, the report on the anti-NHS conspiracy theories, that thinking was already there in the 80s, so it's not new. But when it started, I don't know. I can also say I've read surveys from the time the NHS was set up, and it was not there right from the start. So the idea that maybe that explains part of the sacredness, that a lot of people think of this as somehow a founding myth of modern Britain, that people got together and decided, let's do healthcare in this way, that it was created in this bottom-up democratic way. That is not true. That's not.
Labour lost the election after it was created in 1951.
Does that?
Yes.
And there's also just surveys about where people were asked in the 40s, do you think the voluntary hospitals should be nationalised? And a lot of people were against it. Or So there was the interwar system was basically an insurance system like some of the ones that survive to this day. So it's not that there's this cultural difference between Britain and the continent. Britain had a system like that too. And it was not, judging from those reports that I've seen, was not unpopular, so that there was a lot of demand for making the system more inclusive. That was all there. But then again, that's something that could have been achieved within that system. If that would simply have been the Dutch or German way of saying, well, okay, we have this system which affords medical coverage to a lot of people, that's great, why don't we extend that to everybody? That could have happened instead of the creation of the NHS, and that would probably have been more popular. So it's not that there was a lot of public demand for it at the time. It was really a last minute Bevan decision to go the whole full nationalisation.
Yeah. And any other countries that hold their health service in a similar light?
I haven't come across anything like that. No. Yes.
First of all, thank you. Very interesting talk, a lot of numbers, which is always useful. I have two questions which are quite political. The first one is that the concept of the myth, political myth. I mean, to put aside this kind of political story about why our health system is better than any other, it's kind of the level of whether our football team is better than somebody else's football team, so it doesn't really make sense. But the myth is really about the free access to healthcare, isn't it? And this is what political parties will never say in front of the elections. We are going to change the free access to NHS. And this is the key myth. So my question really to you is whether you agree with the fact that this is what political argument is. My second question to you is, I'm looking at this bar graph here. If you cross-correlate this with the average level of taxation per working person in these countries, and you take away Switzerland and Australia probably, you would easily make an argument that if the UK increased average level of taxation per working person or person in general by 5 to 10%, which is the amount that we are behind Iceland, Netherlands, France, Spain, Sweden, Italy, Denmark, Finland, and all of these other countries, you would probably get UK's bar graph well to the left by just increasing the taxation by 5 to 10%. I would be very surprised if you would be in favor of that. But is this something that you're looking at as part of your research?
Well, okay, but spending is already close to the top.
Well, you said yourself that this is a percentage, and
yeah.
this is, it's all about the numbers, isn't it? So it's about the amounts. I mean, we pay much less tax here, 5 to 10% per person than in Western Europe. So we can't really know whether it's about the amount of money or it's about the system, because it's not a level playing field in terms of the NHS doesn't have the same amount of money because there isn't the same amount of, the pot is not the same as in Western Europe, is it?
Well, it's the overall tax level is still lower here than the Western European average, but we're talking about specifically healthcare rather than spending on the pension system or whatever else, and there Britain has caught up with the rest. And as I said, there are good reasons for doing it in this way, in the percentage of GDP rather than absolute numbers, because of most healthcare costs, 2/3 or so, being staff costs. And staff costs do correlate with GDP per capita average, wealth levels, because people have other options. They could, in order to keep them in the medical workforce, the richer country has to pay them more than the poorer country because they could go away. So that can't really be the issue anymore. Plus also what I said earlier about how I'm looking at bread and butter outcomes rather than how generous the systems are, and I really think in other sectors, so that's why I mentioned the Ryanair example, you wouldn't take that as an excuse. It's not that I'm not complaining about the fact that maybe some systems offer spa holidays. We talked about this. The German system does that. My brother's girlfriend went to a fully paid for spa holiday, where even though she has no health issues that I'm aware of, it's just that that's the system where you can do that. Fully paid for by the insurer. And fine, if you pay more than 12% of GDP on healthcare, you can have that. And I wouldn't blame the NHS for not offering that kind of service, but I would blame them for getting the bread and butter issues wrong. Yes.
Okay. So the other issue. So firstly, actually, I'm quite curious about the efficiency of the UK NHS system, because the figures illustrate that seems that we pay a lot, but seems the outcome is not very well. Of course, in your defense, it's basically people looking at different things. So maybe we cannot just focus on the health outcomes as a figure on that. But I still think the efficiency is quite important in UK. Many people complain about the efficiency now, and the doctors has strike, and we have lack of the staff of maintaining this system. So my question is, so firstly, it's about the efficiency. So what's the comment? Why UK the efficiency has these issues compared with the other countries? So the second question is about so you can see our economy actually is going downhill, and especially after this COVID. If it downhill maintains several years, how to maintain the NHS in a good qualities? Because if the economies are going down a long time, I don't think they have money to maintain this.
Yeah, I mean, firstly on the outcome side, the reason why I focus on the avoidable deaths and mortality rates is simply that is a less subjective measure. Of course, it is true that the purpose of healthcare isn't just to keep people alive. There is maybe a lot that we expect from healthcare that may not be visible in life expectancy figures, but that still matter to us, and you have something that you're anxious about, and you want to be seen. But the trouble with most outcome measures is just for a lot of things, say if you take things like mental health in particular, there's no obvious measure of success or failure. And that's why I've just focused on the ones where it's just unambiguous. Somebody is, after a certain period of treatment, either alive or not, and there's nothing in between, no two ways about it.
So you talking there's no inefficiency issue in UK?
Oh no, massive inefficiencies. I'm just saying the reason why I focus on these measures to the exclusion of others is just that I focus on what's measurable, because for everything else may matter as well, but it's less obvious how we can present it in a way that's just crystal clear and not controversial. On efficiency, that's just generally difficult to measure. The Commonwealth Fund has a category where they look at what they call efficiencies. The problem with it is they just look at administrative spending, which is fairly low here. It's just that's not automatically, that doesn't mean that you have an efficient system. Because I talked about the Blair reforms where they moved to a system where money follows patients. Before they introduced that, there was a system where healthcare providers in the NHS were just given a pot of money which was determined by how much they got in the previous year. Administratively very simple, but also a kind of a stupid system. But that's just the trade-off, that you can save administrative expenditure very easily. It's just that if that means you allocate things in a way that they have no relation to demand and activity, then you create inefficiencies in some other way. Or you could have, more generally, that's a a problem in nationalized industries often. Sometimes they are overmanaged. That's sometimes the argument that we have too many bureaucrats, too many pen pushers, and that's often true. But nationalized systems can also be undermanaged, and that can also be a source of inefficiency. So if you have a system where, say, the doctor arrives, they need some tools in place, and they need medical files, and they need people to work with, and one of those ingredients is missing, right? They arrive, they don't know where to go, they don't have the files, they don't have the tools, and then they can't operate. That's inefficiency, but that can result from undermanagement. So that's an area where if it could well be that if you increase admin spending, but made sure that the doctor has their tools in place, you have a system that's in overall terms more efficient, even if administrative spending is higher. So that's the trouble with efficiency arguments. There's no obvious measure of it. Yes?
Okay, so it's often said the NHS would collapse without immigration. So my perception is countries like France or Finland don't rely to the same extent on immigration fund to staff their healthcare systems. So my questions are, firstly, is this true? Am I right about this? And if it is true, is it some structural nature of the NHS, like it's a monopsony, that makes it reliant on immigration, or is it an unrelated factor about British politics?
We haven't looked at that in great detail. I'd simply say it's the pull factor of the English language, that doctors, health professionals all over the world will have some level of English a lot of them, and you couldn't, if you're a doctor from India or wherever, you couldn't in the same way move to Finland because nobody outside of Finland speaks any Finnish. So there's that, the pull factor, and there's also the fact that medical places and universities are capped, and then you get the standard central planning problem, that they just try to project how many healthcare workers they will need in 5 or 10 years, and of course always get it wrong. And that's where I would just have, even within the system that we have now, that's something that you could make more market-oriented. You could say, you have a completely uncapped system. Anyone who wants to study medicine can give it a go, but there's just no guarantee that you will get anything. If too many people sign up and there's not enough demand then for healthcare workers, then bad luck. Then you have to do something else, and also just give treat individual NHS trusts more like employers, so that they can say, even in the system that we have now, why do there need to be national pay scales? Why not? Why shouldn't the contracts be between the hospital you work for, or whatever the healthcare provider is, and you, the individual? And that's where you can have something like a medical labour market, even within the current system, and maybe that would then be less reliant on immigration.
Did you get that licensing effect in other countries, the restriction of supply of doctors?
I haven't looked at how the licensing process works. I've just seen that there are massive differences in the number of doctors per population. So I think in Austria, in Switzerland, it's far higher than elsewhere. So they do have a licensing system, it just can't be much of a constraint. So that's clearly the difference. When you have systems where, so we talked about during the break about the US, where they have that same pull factor, and the English language, and also being superbly very high wages for the medical sector. That can't be anything other than doctors' unions keeping people out, because surely people from all over the world would want to emigrate to the United States and practice there in medicine if it's so well paid and if it's language-wise easy. The fact that they don't have that must just be purely licensing restrictions.
Yeah, except the Filipino nurses, but maybe they don't have so much leverage.
They may have some of them, but overall numbers are just far lower than you would expect given their pay levels. Yes?
Yeah, to follow up on that, you were talking about that earlier. Obviously, in the US, there's supply constraints on doctors to increase the wage levels. UK, it feels like the NHS is getting, particularly people like BMA, is getting increasingly like a union or a guild, and is functioning in favour of the members. They'll say things like, we can't possibly accept this change because of patient safety, but you can get more money, then suddenly all those objections disappear. It feels like a lot of that's work that it affects wages and conditions, so a lot more doctors working part-time, particularly GPs, which is reduced the supply, and they're clearly restricting and constrained. The other side of it is, when it gets unionised, they don't want to reorganise and change. It's the sort of Luddite tendency, so it's likely in future medicine, if costs are going up everywhere, if they're going to ever come down, it will be technology, it will be robotic surgeons, it will be Google, etc., etc. I suppose the question is there anywhere in the world currently that is bringing down those barriers and actually changing fundamentally the way they deliver healthcare and actually seeing results?
Yeah, and not in the developed world. That's something that happens in emerging economies. We had an external author writing a paper for us on that issue, where he looked at private clinics in India and China, and so for some procedures they have Western style survival rates, and quality wise they seem to be as good as any Western institution, but they do it for a fraction of the cost. So that shows it is possible, and I guess they just don't have the medical profession probably just never had the chance to organize itself in a way that it does in developed countries. So that's in the OECD. I haven't found a complete counterexample where you get really low priced, good quality healthcare. So some of these systems have better outcomes, but are they better? Are they greater cutting costs? No, not really. That's a problem. Like whether you have a nationalized system or private insurance system or mixed system, that's a problem that seems to be common to all of them.
Yeah, so we're just doomed to higher costs and whatever until somebody outside shakes it all up.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it was to the extent that there are any changes. That was also one of the Blair era changes that they gave. Historically, the NHS I think used to be far more hierarchical. That nurses had very little autonomy. They had to ask a consultant for everything, and that was one of the Blair era changes that they gave for routine procedures. That they said, well, not everything has to be supervised by a doctor. Here, why not let the nurse make that decision? And if they are unsure, they can still ask the doctor, but have that possibility at least. And that did happen. I think, if I remember correctly, pretty good outcomes, but it was clearly resisted by the BMA, which also is a bit ironic given that the NHS has this egalitarian ethos, but you combine that with the BMA being very defensive about hierarchy, and I guess to people who work in the NHS, it probably doesn't feel very egalitarian. Yes?
I'm wondering whether you think that change might be forced on the NHS by patients. Patients who might not want to be hanging around on a waiting list that is 7 million plus, and who are opting to go privately. Now, the statistics are very opaque for those who use private medicine. I don't know why that is, but it seems that something like 13% of us already use private medicine, and there's increasing evidence that maybe more and more people are sort of pay as you go. They're not feeling well, they can go and see a GP, maybe online, consult a GP, have a consultation for about 70 quid. And they think, well, rather than wait, I can get this over and done with, it's the cost of half a night out or something. I appreciate this isn't for everyone. Also, the great unspoken about healthcare, and something that really does affect healthcare, is dentistry. Now, even Keir Starmer, who was absolutely adamant that he was prepared to see almost a, relation die, rather than use private medicine, admitted last week that he uses private dentistry. And more people are using that, and NHS dentistry is withering away in vast areas of the country. So might the same impact be had across the health service as more and more people decide to go privately?
That would only happen if that leads to a wider rethink of whether there's maybe something wrong with the regular system if you have to opt out. But I could imagine a situation, and I'm always pessimistic about political trends, well, often proven right, unfortunately, that you could imagine a situation where a lot of people opt privately but still defend the NHS in the abstract, in a way that happens with independent schools. You know, that there's always the tabloid press likes to go after left-wing politicians who send their kids to private schools. There's this kind of national sport saying, look at these hypocrites defending the system, but not for their kids, of course. But you could imagine something like that in healthcare as well, and it does happen to the extent that you get people revering the NHS in the abstract, but then also talking about how some of their colleagues, I mean medical professionals in particular, how they leave, how they emigrate and move to countries with more market-based systems. And you think, well, why don't they make that connection? Is there some obvious inconsistency here? But as long as, I guess it is possible to develop a firewall in your mind and not seeing the inconsistency there. And if something like that happens, you could have loads of people going private and still defend the NHS. And that the latest British Social Attitude Survey, they don't specifically talk about private insurance, but they do show that there are now far lower rates of approval or satisfaction rates with the NHS than there ever were historically. You get now, I think, an absolute majority even of people who say they are unsatisfied with, well, their experience of the NHS. But then when they ask, why do you think that is, and what do you think about the NHS in general, there you absolutely do see that divide. Like the same people who say I'm not happy at all, I'm totally dissatisfied, but the NHS as an idea is still absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So yeah, we've seen quite a few figures that indicate utilisation of funds in the UK NHS is not proportionate to the outcomes that we get at the bottom line, and then there are quite a few countries that obviously had better results in that area. So when it comes to those other countries that also do have a nationalised health system but are getting better outcomes with maybe even less investment, what would you say are some key lessons that we can learn from them and that we can potentially implement here?
Yeah, so there are some systems that are somewhat NHS-like in the sense of being tax-funded, mostly public, and that do better than the actual NHS. Those tend to be in small countries or very regionalized, like the Swedish system. So they don't have a national health service, they have local health services. I say if you have to have state-provided healthcare, I'd rather not have it, but if you have to have that, then I'd rather have a decentralized system, or, well, I mean, Iceland is just so small that it's automatically population less than a borough of London, so that's, even if they organize it at the national level, it would be in equivalent terms a decentralized one. If you have to have a state-run system, make it at least highly localized so that there's comparisons and maybe even competition in the sense of moving between regions. But of course, once you accept that principle that that's a good thing, that people have that choice and the possibility to compare, then I'd say why not go all the way and just have a market-based system like in the Netherlands or Switzerland. And what else was I going to say? I forgot it already.
Do we have one more question? Probably we don't want to keep you too long.
The champion blonde is desperate to have this question.
Some of it's been covered already, but one comment actually I was going to make is in the US the federal government does actually engage in price setting, because when Medicare and Medicaid are negotiating contracts, they set kind of pay caps for particular types of doctors. So if you look at like endocrinology, they get the price cap too low, so there's a shortage of endocrinologists compared to other professions, and some professions pay too high, so there's a glut, and that kind of feeds into the wider market, which is worth noting. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is, I noticed that some of your stats here label UK, but actually mean England, because Scotland and Wales do not publish standardised health measures in the same way as England does. Wales has recently got a bit better, and it's revealed waiting lists sometimes twice as long as England. Wales, as far as I can tell, didn't go through the Blairite reforms and has a sort of old school NHS fully state monopoly system. I just wanted to ask you if you sort of looked into those inter-UK comparisons and if there are any lessons to learn from them.
Yes, there was a paper that came out after the Blair reforms where they looked at specifically the English-Welsh border area, where they said this is an area which is the economic demographic factors reasonably similar. It's just that you have the Blair reforms on one side of the border and only a watered down version on the other side. And they did say outcomes were better on the English side. So again, I'd rather not have National Health Service, but if we must have one, I'd rather have one with the Blair reforms than the old school one. England versus Scotland, Wales, at least at the time, would have been that comparison rule. But again, once you accept that logic, that market mechanisms actually can lead to improvements, why not go all the way? Why stop with at the level where Blair stopped?
Right, nines, we should probably. Thank you very much. That's great. So this will be put on our YouTube channel and our podcast app, so we'll send out an email from the video now. We've got 2 events we're planning. We've got one on mental health. Is mental health real? Should we take it seriously? And the other one by a Metropolitan Police officer who's going to be talking about the influence of DEI and sort of woke ideology in the Met Police. And finally, if you want another controversial event this week, there's one on Thursday. Thursday, right?
That's
and
right.
It's by Professor Nigel Biggar, and it's against decolonisation, is that right?
Yeah, deconstructing
decolonization.
Decolonisation.
Yeah, that's by Modern Dissent. You can Google that or speak to Alex afterwards. And he can
Well, if you come to me, I can give you tours of the tickets. I'll tell you more about it, indeed.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks very much for all coming, and see you next time. Thank you very much.
I have to say, Audrey.